The morality trap, how we became afraid to think for ourselves. What if I told you that the morality you've been taught since childhood, the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, isn't actually about truth? What if it was never about justice, or virtue, or even kindness? What if it was just a tool designed not to set you free, but to keep you in line? That's not a conspiracy theory, that's Nietzsche. And he wasn't being dramatic, he was being honest, brutally honest. He saw something in humanity that most people still don't want to accept. That morality isn't a light from heaven. It's a leash, and most of us are wearing it proudly. Because it makes us feel safe. It makes us feel good. But here's the question, what if feeling good isn't the same as being free? Nietzsche's insight was terrifying because it exposed something we all intuitively sense but rarely name, that morality, for most people, is nothing more than a herd instinct. A psychological reflex designed to keep society stable, not to help individuals think. We're told morality is about higher principles, but in practice it's about conformity. We praise what the group praises, we condemn what the group condemns, and we feel righteous doing it. But look deeper and you'll see this righteousness is often blind. It's not based on deep thought or reasoned judgment. It's based on fear. Fear of standing out, fear of being wrong, fear of being punished by the group. Nietzsche called this the morality of the slave, the morality of the weak, who don't dare to live on their own terms, so they moralize obedience and call it virtue.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And here's where it gets even darker. This herd morality doesn't just shape how we behave. It shapes how we think. It tells us what questions we're allowed to ask, what topics we're allowed to explore, what truths we're allowed to speak. And if we cross those invisible lines, we're labeled immoral not because our ideas are false, but because they're uncomfortable. That's the trick. Morality becomes a weapon against truth by making people afraid to even search for it. It becomes a kind of intellectual cage, wide enough to walk in, but never wide enough to escape. And the bars aren't made of steel. They're made of shame. That's why this insight is so disturbing, because once you see it, you start to wonder, how much of my morality is really mine? And how much of it was injected into me without my permission? You start to look at your values differently. You start to interrogate the things you automatically feel good about. You begin to notice that the moral judgments you pass on others about their beliefs, their actions, their failures often have more to do with what everyone else says than what you've deeply considered. And that's the moment Nietzsche wanted you to reach. Not because he wanted you to become immoral, but because he wanted you to become free. He didn't hate morality. He hated fake morality. Morality that exists to control, not to clarify, and to suppress, not to elevate. And the first step to escaping it is brutal but necessary. You have to accept that most of what you call moral is actually just popular. And if you want to live truthfully, you have to be ready to become unpopular. Beyond good and evil, the dangerous freedom of thinking for yourself. Once you realize that morality is largely a herd instinct, you're faced with a terrifying question. If the rules aren't real, then what do I follow? That's the crack Nietzsche drives straight into your soul. Because most people don't want that kind of freedom. They say they do. They say they want to think independently, live authentically, break the mold. But when the mold actually breaks, when no one tells you what to do, what to believe, who to be. Most people panic. They don't feel liberated, they feel lost. Because the truth is, freedom is heavy. Freedom demands choices, and choices demand responsibility. Most of us would rather be morally correct by default than become someone that can carry their own ethical weight. It's easier to obey than to create, easier to follow the map than to carve a new path through the jungle of existence. Nietzsche's answer was shocking, even offensive to the moralists of his time and ours. He said that if you want to live honestly, you have to go beyond good and evil. Not in the sense of doing evil, but in refusing to let those labels define your thinking. Because once you stop asking whether something is good or bad by society's standards, a new question emerges, one that's far more powerful, far more dangerous. Is this life-affirming? Does this belief, this action, this value make me stronger? Deeper? More creative? More alive? If it doesn't, then maybe it's not morality, it's decay disguised as virtue. Nietzsche believed morality should not be a cage we shrink inside, but a forge we walk through. And if your morality hasn't made you uncomfortable, hasn't burned away something false inside you, then it's not morality. It's social programming. Think about how we teach children. We don't usually teach them to think morally, we teach them to obey moral authority. Don't hit your sister. Say thank you. Don't lie. These are good rules, right? But are they taught as invitations to reflect or commands to submit? When a child asks why, we often shut them down. We don't teach them to examine the roots of morality, we teach them to become comfortable with the rules. And then we grow up, still thinking that morality is about fitting in, still believing that being a good person means doing what most people approve of. But real morality, the kind that Nietzsche pointed toward, is not about comfort. It's about confrontation. You confront your instincts. You confront your culture. You confront your desires. And you decide not once, but over and over, what kind of person do I want to become? And here's where Nietzsche makes his most radical move. He says, don't look to the group. Look inward, not to your feelings, not to your conscience if it's been trained by the herd. Look deeper. Look to your will to power, your inner drive to overcome, to grow, to shape reality, not just reflect it. That's where your true morality lives, not in submission, but in self-creation, in becoming the kind of person who doesn't need the herd, who doesn't need praise, who doesn't fear being labeled wrong. Nietzsche called this person the Übermensch, the Overman, the one who creates new values, not out of rebellion, but out of the overflow of life. And that might be the biggest challenge he ever gave us. Can you become someone who doesn't just follow morality, but creates it? The Overman's Path: How to Destroy False Morality and Rebuild Your Soul. So, what does it actually mean to go beyond the herd? To walk the path of the Overman, the one who creates their own values in a world full of borrowed ones. It means you have to become dangerous, not in the violent sense, but in the existential sense. You have to become someone who threatens the illusion, someone who thinks so deeply, so independently, that your very presence exposes the shallow foundations of those who still walk in chains and call them wings. Nietzsche wasn't calling for chaos, but he wasn't endorsing cruelty. He was calling for authenticity, but not the cheap kind you post online, the kind that's paid for in blood, the kind that requires you to strip away everything false, everything second-hand, everything inherited, and rebuild your soul from the raw materials of your own honest experience. But here's the truth nobody tells you. The moment you start creating your own values, you become terrifying to others. Because you no longer need their approval. You no longer use their morality as your compass. You've stopped asking, "Is this good?" and started asking, "Is this true to the life I want to live?" And that question breaks people. Because most don't know what kind of life they want, they only know how to fit into the one they've been handed. That's why Nietzsche's Overman is so rare. Not because we can't become one, but because we're afraid to. We're afraid of what we might have to sacrifice: social approval, comfort, familiarity, even love. But Nietzsche's promise is this: if you have the courage to walk that lonely road, you don't just find yourself, you become yourself. And that's a life worth living. Now, let's get brutally practical. How do you actually do this? How do you destroy false morality and start living with integrity that you forged? Step 1. You have to audit your beliefs ruthlessly. Take every moral claim you've inherited, every should, every shouldn't, every rule you've absorbed from religion, school, society, social media, and ask, where did this come from? Did I choose this? Or was it chosen for me? And most importantly, does this belief serve the person I want to become, or just the system I was born into? If the answer is the system, you let it go. You kill it. You don't explain it. You don't justify it. You throw it into the fire and watch what rises in its place. But Step 2. You cultivate inner strength. Because once you stop living by the herd, you're going to feel alone, deeply alone. And that's where most people turn back. They mistake loneliness for error. But it's not error, it's freedom. And freedom is heavy. You'll be tempted to run back to the safety of the crowd, to apologize, to conform, to feel morally clean again. But don't. Stay in the fire. Let the old self burn. That's the only way something new can be forged. Nietzsche believed that the greatest individuals in history, artists, philosophers, warriors, weren't just talented. They were resilient. They stood alone and didn't flinch. And that's what makes their morality real. Not because it was handed to them, but because they earned it. Step 3. Reverse the question. Stop asking what's moral. Start asking, what makes me more alive? What deepens my power? What expands my vision? What actions make me feel like I'm rising, not shrinking? This is not selfishness, it's sovereignty. Because a truly sovereign human doesn't need to dominate others, they only need to dominate themselves. They live by an internal code that's forged through reflection, action, and consequence. That's what Nietzsche meant by a morality beyond good and evil. Not chaos, not relativism, but creation. The ability to stare into the abyss of existence and bring forth something beautiful, not because it's approved, but because it's true. And here's what you discover at the end of that road. The herd never had the answers. It had safety, it had comfort, it had unity, but it didn't have truth. And truth, the real kind, is earned in solitude, in rebellion, in fire. You don't find it in slogans or consensus or applause. You find it when you're willing to risk being wrong, when you're willing to lose everything fake in order to gain one thing real. And once you have that, once you know who you are, because you've made yourself, no one can take it from you. not the crowd, not the critics, not even your own fear. That's what makes the Overman powerful. Not that he's above others, but that he's beyond them, beyond imitation, beyond dependence, beyond morality as obedience. He is moral because he chooses to be not, because he's afraid not to be. So here's the final question. Are you willing to kill the morality that was handed to you in order to discover the morality that's waiting inside you? Are you willing to walk away from the herd, not because you hate them, but because you refuse to be owned by them? Are you ready to become someone so rooted in your own truth that the world can no longer control you with shame, guilt, or fear? That's Nietzsche's dark insight. That morality, as we've known it, is a tool of the collective. And that freedom, real, terrifying, powerful freedom, only begins when you stop asking what's right and start becoming what's true.